Allison Yamamoto. What a great conversation with Allison. Fascinating woman. She was an athlete in the NCAA in college, marathon runner. Noticed that she was having low energy. Noticed that she needed to make some changes in her life. Do you know what REDS is? Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport. Well, she suffered from it, and she didn't have a period for 6 years. And the doctor said that's regular, that's typical for an athlete. And it's not. And what did she do to turn it around? We talk about perfectionism. Like I said, she was a marathon runner as well. Her parents were very active, so she just kind of strived for this perfectionism, and it turned, into this bad thing. And she was a double major in college, and fascinating woman. What she's done to turn it around, and what she's doing to help others with it as well. Is there such a thing as addiction to exercise? Have you ever considered that? But just a great conversation with Allison and what she's doing now and how she's helping people. And I talked about identity and where that is and control. And her view on discipline is quite unique as well. Great conversation with Allison. I really, really enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. Hi, I'm Joey Pinz, and here's my 45-second introduction. After starting my business in the 90s, I started developing poor habits of eating in my diet because I was working way too much. Before you know it, I found myself 340 pounds. The doctor told me if I don't lose the weight, I'm not going to see my daughter graduate. Took the next 7 months, lost 130 pounds. People think there's some secret. Ask me, how'd you lose that weight? Like there's some secret. There is no secret. How'd I lose the weight? Just one word: discipline. I've had other successes in life, and I attribute them all to discipline. Now, I'm not the king of discipline, but I believe that it can help all of us. Friends, colleagues convinced me to start a podcast. The podcast mission: how do we better ourselves and society? I talk to interesting people in health, fitness, sport, wellness, business, technology, science, art, and culture. And I eventually ask them how discipline plays a role in their life. Podcast vision: growth through learning from others. I'm very excited to talk to you, Allison Yamamoto. Thank you so much for your time. I'm very, very excited. I know we had to push this off a couple times. What happens when someone works out too much?
Yeah, so it's funny because we don't often think about it. I think that oftentimes when we think about exercise, we think about being disciplined means going after it every single day, no matter how you feel, and that more is always better when it comes to exercise. And there's actually a limit that you can reach when it comes to training. Not so much in terms of like how much you can do versus like whether you could run 26 miles or 5 miles, as much as if you get into a state where you're not providing your body with enough recovery and rest to be able to rebuild and then go after another session, then you can get into a state what is called overtraining syndrome, where essentially you're not really able to make performance gains anymore because your body isn't getting that appropriate and adequate amount of recovery time. And in a weird way, it's the folks that are really, really viewing themselves as like the most disciplined. They're probably getting so many compliments from other people that are really prone to falling into this. And oftentimes there's modifications that you can make around your training that can really prevent those situations where you end up overtraining, and in that way you're actually inhibiting your own performance and your own muscle recovery and your own fitness, probably unintentionally.
So isn't it an addiction like any other?
That's such an interesting question. So there is this phrase called exercise addiction, and there is a book that I think is really interesting in exploring this topic about exercise addiction. And it's not like an official diagnosis in the same way that other addictions are. However, you're right in that a lot of people fall into a situation where exercise becomes a huge part of their coping mechanism. It's something that you feel like you have to do every single day, where if you take even one rest day, you could feel a lot of anxiety or feel like there's going to be major consequences as a result of one day of rest or where you're taking one day off. And a lot of that behavior can feel addicting in a way, in the sense that it doesn't really feel like it's necessarily in your control. You don't feel like you have a choice as to whether or not you're able to just scale back from exercise. And I think it's really interesting because it's something that from a lot of external perspectives, unlike where you might have an addiction to say like alcohol or drugs, or a lot of the conventional addictions that we hear about, a lot of times from the external or from the exterior, people are envying what you're doing, or they're
Hmm.
praising it. They're
Hmm.
saying, oh my gosh, you're so disciplined. I wish that I could work out like you are. But it can be a really hard experience to have when you're feeling a lot of those addictive tendencies towards exercise, because what can happen is then you're in a state where you feel like you're planning your day or your week around your exercise, or you feel
Hmm.
like if you're going to go on vacation, you're prioritizing how am I going to get the exercise in, and if it doesn't get in, then there's a feeling of anxiety or restlessness or stress throughout the rest of the day because you didn't get in that session.
Hmm.
And I think that there's a spectrum where it can tip into feeling like it's almost more stressful the way that you're relating to exercise, instead of something that can be really enjoyable and something that can be really empowering. And especially where it's feeling like you have to continue to exercise even when your body is showing signs of fatigue and showing signs of overtraining. Those are instances, or even where you're sick. You know, you could be ill, you could be injured, and still pushing through. And I've definitely been in states of my life where I felt like if I was injured, it was kind of the end of end all because of
Hmm.
how much anxiety would be induced because of having to take that rest day. But it's something that we don't really talk about in terms of the other side of exercise, where it's not always more is better. And there are instances where relating to exercise can feel more like an addiction and less like something that you're doing out of joy and out of empowerment and out of feeling really strong and performant during your workout sessions.
Hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating to me how addiction comes into play in areas where you wouldn't think it was the case. Now you're a relatively small family. Your parents are both really high end athletes. I think you have one sibling. You said, and uh, but you started exercising and working out, and then misdiagnosed. I mean, you didn't have your period for 6 years, and the doctor said that was okay.
Yes. Yeah. It's such an interesting experience because I think that, and I'm hoping that increasingly now more information is coming out about these types of issues because it is so common. There are prevalent studies that say that up to, the majority, up to 70%, so up to the majority of active women are experiencing menstrual disturbances because of
Wow.
their training, or in some ways they're struggling with energy availability. And that's a huge portion of the population, but it makes sense because a lot of the times the women that are active are also really interested in their health. And if you're interested in health, then a lot of the information that comes around nutrition and how we need to be fueling can either be something that's not applicable to women, or it can be promoting dieting trends that are so restrictive that it's causing an increased risk of being in a state of low energy availability, which is what causes the issue like what I had, which was, the technical term for it is relative energy deficiency in sport. But essentially, what it means is it essentially just means that you're not getting enough fuel for what your body needs to be able to train and to be able to live daily activities. And what will happen is your body just starts to shut down processes that it thinks that it doesn't need in a state of survival.
Hmm.
And so in my case, and one of in some of the more like critical cases, your period will go missing. And when your period goes missing, it essentially is that leading indicator to you, especially if you're training. And when I'm saying training, and when I say athletes, I think a lot of people, adults, maybe women specifically, and I was fall in this category myself, hesitate to identify with the term athlete.
Hmm.
We think of athletes as like Olympians, or we think of
Hmm.
athletes as performing at a very elite level. And yet if you're going to exercise classes multiple times a week, if you're going for walks or runs or cycles or whatever it is that you're doing, taking exercise classes, CrossFit, all of those I definitely would incorporate into this very active, this athlete camp.
Hmm.
And what can happen is, in those populations, in a very extreme case where you're experiencing chronic low energy availability, you can lose your period. There's a lot of other leading indicators that you're in a state of low energy availability, and that can be problematic for reasons beyond just fertility. And I think that learning about this and learning about all the reasons outside of fertility that it matters to address any sort of issues you're having with energy availability is what really inspired me to take action on it. because what I thought was just, oh, well, the doctors are saying because I exercise, it's normal for me to not get a period.
Hmm.
And I'm not really trying to prioritize having a family in my early 20s, for example.
Right.
And so it was easy for me to procrastinate, which is why it took so long for me to take action and actually go through support. That and the fact that the actual recovery journey was much harder than I anticipated it to be. But I would say that a lot of the risks are far and beyond fertility. There's everything from the way that your training is going to be impacted. Could be experiencing brain fog. You could experience decreases in libido. You're feeling cold a lot of the time. And then
Wow.
one of the biggest ones is bone health.
Hmm.
And so, in that low energy availability, you're actually risking your own bone health, which, especially for a woman, is a major issue because it increases your risk of getting stress fractures.
Ooh.
And then, longer term down the line, there can be even bigger risks. But for me, as a runner, I was really worried about getting an injury like a stress fracture because that's the type of injury that'll take you out for a long period of time. It takes a long time to heal and it increases your risk of having other bone related injuries later down the line. And so I didn't realize that I was increasing my risk significantly during the period of time when I was in low energy availability for such a long period of time when I was still training. So
Hmm.
I think it's something that I wish more women knew about.
You mentioned relative energy deficiency in sport, REDS. So were you officially diagnosed with that?
It's funny, I never received an official clinical diagnosis from a physician.
Hmm.
And I think that was because at the period of time where I was experiencing it, it was going through a little bit of a transition where it was previously female athlete triad. So that was something that had been thrown around a
Hmm.
few times that then was evolved into this term of relative energy deficiency in sport because it is something that happens to men as well.
Oh, it
There's just
is.
different factors that you can watch out for if you're not a menstruating human. But it wasn't something that I ever received a clinical diagnosis for in terms of specifically REDS. However, the other thing that is a leading indicator and oftentimes correlates with REDS is the missing period that I mentioned. And so the other clinical diagnosis that people will receive who are menstruating is hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is a helpful diagnosis to get if you are a woman and you are experiencing menstrual disturbances. It's important to know what is causing those, and there are a lot of other, not a lot, but there are other diagnoses that could be contributing to this, such as PCOS or endometriosis. And getting a
Hmm.
diagnosis that really nails down what that is can be helpful because, in the case like for me, where hypothalamic amenorrhea is one diagnosis that goes alongside REDS, which essentially means that you're experiencing a missing period because of lifestyle factors.
Hmm.
It's helpful to know that because then you can address it and fix it through restoring your energy availability. And so it's actually very reversible and it's a helpful feedback loop that your body is telling you as one signal that you're in this low energy availability.
So during that time where you had REDS, did you have low energy?
That's such a funny question. It's funny because at the time when I was experiencing it, I would never have said to you, I'm experiencing low
Right.
energy. I just didn't realize that I was experiencing it until after the fact. But
Hmm.
now I would say that at the time I was experiencing low energy because there would be times where I would go for a long run and the rest of the day just be out. I would feel
Hmm.
so tired. I wouldn't really want to go for walks or feel like I could exert myself physically in any way. There were a lot of instances where on a day to day, I would just feel really big dips in energy in the afternoon that I think were pretty normalized. Like, oh, just, go to get your coffee fix, or you're probably just need to maybe get up and change your scenery a little bit, or maybe you're burnt out from work. And that was the other thing is I would get really easily like into these states of chronic stress where
Hmm.
I would just feel really burnt out, really exhausted. And the funny thing was, there was a lot of times also where I'd go into a workout and I would just feel super tired. Like, even in
Hmm.
the first few minutes, it was really hard for me to motivate. But because I was so used to this notion of endurance and this praise for discipline, at the time, it was never bad enough that I wasn't still performing well enough at work and doing things that I need to get done. I wasn't missing training sessions or unable to muster up the longer runs. And in some cases, I was even doing fairly well in races relative to what I had known.
Hmm.
And so that's why at the time, it's not something I had realized until afterwards when I reflect on it. And there were even like emotional signals that I was, low energy, as you might say, because
Hmm.
I would be really irritable or my temper would just be pretty on edge. And I thought that that was just kind of part of my personality,
Hmm.
or that I never really related that to energy availability, or I'd never really related that to the way that I was navigating nutrition and exercise, because I was somebody that was thinking so much about being really, really on it when it came to my nutrition, when it came to my exercise, that I
Hmm.
never really thought that that could be the culprit. I thought that I had gotten that down almost to perfection, if you will. And I think that that's where I never realized that that goal that I had towards perfection was exactly the problem.
I'm an athlete as well. We have to live with a certain amount of discomfort, right? That's part of being an athlete. The problem is that when there's a real issue, we think it's just because it's hard to exercise and you get tired. But when there's real symptoms there, sometimes we can't identify because we're just used to fighting them off.
I think that's 100% right. And it's so interesting because a lot of times when we are athletes, we are maybe even in a way more interested in the
Mm,
discomfort. Like we've
mm,
been so used
yeah,
to
yeah.
being
We look for it.
affiliating that with the reward
Yeah,
and saying, oh, we're not going to have any gain unless we're experiencing discomfort.
right.
We're not actually going to achieve what we need to achieve unless there is discomfort. And I think that a lot of times the people that are really active get into these modes, maybe even beyond just the workout side of life, where we think that suffering is inevitable and even necessary for achievement. And then we view any sort of rest or any sort of recovery even as like indulgent.
Mm,
And I think that that was something that I was definitely falling into those patterns really deeply, where of course, like you go on a long run, it's not going to be all, flowery and fun for when you're training for a marathon, 20-ish miles that you're going for that run. And I think that for me, there, to your point, crossing that line was really, really hard for me to see when that happened.
mm,
And I think that being able to take that holistic approach and getting out of the mindset of endurance is always better, pushing through is always better. What are my limits in terms of what I can push through, is a really, really, really hard mental shift, but a really necessary one, because it's once you actually know and can identify the signs, it's easier to question whether or not it's something that you're falling into. But it's also why I like to highlight some of the behavioral aspects, because even if you're one of those people that can push through no matter what, and you can endure all those
mm,
random little minor, areas of fatigue or little red flags, yellow flags that are going off, the behavioral aspects make it easier to catch that something's happening. And
mm,
those are things like, how are you relating to food? Are there certain foods or food groups that you feel really guilty around, or that you feel like you restrict or avoid altogether? Do you feel like you're adhering to diets on a regular basis? Do you feel like there's some, you have a lot of thoughts around food, and you feel like maybe there are some instances where when you're eating, you suddenly get a compulsion to feel out of control around food? So there's some
mm,
more
mm.
behavioral aspects, or like struggling to take a rest day, fearing a rest day altogether, and avoiding a rest day at all costs. So they're like behavioral aspects that I like to lean into a little bit more, because sometimes it's easier for someone to see within themselves those behavioral aspects, even when some of the more subtle yellow flags are harder to catch.
Mm. Yeah, well, sis, Allison, you were a marathon runner. You're NCAA cheerleader with a double major, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, so we talk about, you mentioned before, this strive for perfectionism. I mean, you're used to dealing with difficult things. You put difficult tasks ahead of you, and then when something trivial, when something that not that difficult approaches you, perhaps you think, "Oh, I've dealt with harder things than that. I'm just going to ignore that and push it to the side. Is that a symptom as well?
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that because there's actually been articles that have been published about how perfectionism is one of the things that makes you more predisposed to
Mm.
develop something like low energy availability. And I was not actually someone who identified as a perfectionist for, well, a really long time, because I always affiliated perfectionism, and hopefully most other people out there already know this, but I didn't, so I like to share it, which is that I always affiliated perfectionism with very specific things. Like every single thing in your life was lined
Mm.
up perfectly, and you were
Mm.
perfectly organized, and you always like dressed perfectly, and everything was perfect.
Mm.
Um, and I'm not one of those people
Mm.
who every single thing down to a T always had to be perfect. But the definition that resonated with me a lot was the notion that the standards that you set for yourself are always so high,
Mm.
maybe higher than you would expect someone else to achieve, or higher than you even expect of others in your life. And I think that that was a definition that helped me resonate with a lot more. And being able to tie the dots between, oh, I set really high standards for myself when it comes to school and when it comes to work, which is again praised, and then setting those same high standards when it comes to exercise or when it comes to nutrition. And again, in some ways, those are praised by other people who are saying, oh my gosh, you eat so healthy, or
Mm.
you're
Mm.
exercising so disciplined, and I wish that I could do the same thing. But the standards can come up in really, really minute ways, like completely avoiding foods that you believe or have labeled as bad,
Mm.
or feeling like you have to hit a certain workout and a certain expectation around that workout, and otherwise you feel like a failure. Meaning,
Mm.
there were days where I would go out for a run and I would run multiple miles, and I would come back and be like, well, I know that I am capable of going further, or I
Mm.
had planned to go this speed or this distance or whatever it was, and come back and actually be like, I feel really dissatisfied because
Mm.
of one thing that a
Mm.
workout that I had done
Mm.
or achieved, that
Mm.
in any objective perspective would be like, you went out and you did a run that was multiple miles long. Like, there's no world where that is something that you punish yourself for. Your body is healthy, it's functioning. Um, but having those high standards show up in the day to day when it came to my nutrition and my exercise was something that I really had to unpack and uncover in order to fully address a lot of the challenges that I was experiencing when it came to this whole condition I was in with low energy availability, and flavors of overtraining sprinkled in there as well.
So if we think we know somebody who's in this within this the parameters of this syndrome, this REDS, what can we do to help them?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing because I think this is going to really be dependent on your relationship to them,
Mm.
as well as the person. Of course, there's going to be some things that are dependent there. But I usually like to say that a lot of it is going to start with asking questions and being genuinely curious about the person rather than presuming anything about them, which is just to understand a little bit more about what's motivating them, or um, you know really starting from a place of observations, things that you're seeing, factual things that you're seeing, rather than placing any judgment. Because I think that in many cases, either what they're doing is coming from a place and motivated from a place where they feel really safe in these behaviors. And so any threat to that is going to feel not something that they can be very open to, or
Mm.
they're in a place where they suspect that something might be off, and maybe there is some layer of shame around this, that they don't understand why they can't change, or they don't understand why they might be doing things that aren't normal, or what they perceive to be normal based on
Mm.
what other people are doing. And so that's why I always like to really emphasize to suspend any judgment and really focus on asking
Mm.
questions
Mm.
and keeping an open mind towards where they're at in their journey. And then the other thing is, and this is again going to really depend on your relationship to them, but in some cases is just education, like providing information about things that and for coming from a place of wanting to support them, or routing them to somebody who can have that conversation with them.
Hmm.
And so that could be someone like myself who could relate to them because I've been through the experience, but
Right.
also who has a lot of information about what the risks are, how this could be impacting some of their goals, even when it comes to their own fitness, their own performance, their own body standards, if you will, even.
Mm.
And or somebody else if they're experiencing like more clinical related symptoms, because this can result in digestive issues. It can impact such a wide variety of things, but we mentioned injuries already. It could be causing digestive issues, menstrual related issues. Being able to encourage them to seek support. And I will say that one of the risks in this area is that I've just heard so many stories from people, including who had a similar, experience to what I had, which is going to a trusted source, maybe a clinician who doesn't have as much information about this type of
Mm.
issue, and then either getting dismissed or misdiagnosed in a similar way that I was. And so I think that having somebody who does have expertise in this area can be really, really helpful, so that they won't get into a state where they're going to a doctor who might not have as much education about it, and then being dismissed in a situation where they shouldn't be.
Mm.
And I think that this is one of those where, fortunately and unfortunately, it's not such a major issue that, every single doctor is going to look at this and say, you're at risk of a very huge life or death situation right now that you'll need to seek support, in most cases. And so in that case, it might be easier to dismiss. It really shouldn't be, because there are many health issues that can result from this. But I personally just have seen so many folks that I've worked with have that experience where it wasn't a priority because it wasn't an immediate threat to their life. And yet this is something where the earlier that you treat it, the better outcomes can be now, and also the better outcomes you can have later on down the road.
Hmm. So how did you get out, Allison?
Yes. The question of all questions. I wish it was something really, really easy, but if I were to distill it down to a few things, it was restoring my energy availability. So I
Mm.
had to work on my nutrition and really make some changes to how I was approaching nutrition, and unlearned a lot of things that I thought were necessary and healthy that were actually really harmful, especially for me in my case. It was really rethinking my training. And so I personally was falling into a lot of issues with my own overtraining. So there were modifications that I had to make, and that were really helpful actually in my training overall and how I would feel during my training. And then I think the most important aspect of it was really addressing what was kind of underneath the surface.
Hmm.
And so, as I mentioned, like for me, it wasn't super easy in my case to just tell me you need to take a rest day and you need to make these changes and then you're good to go. And in some cases that is all it takes for people. And it's
Wow.
just those two things, and then they're good to go. And it's that, and most of the time that's when the major issue was just education. And they didn't realize that they were making these mistakes because they either weren't thinking about it at all, or they just didn't realize that they were doing the wrong things when they were really investing in their nutrition in certain ways. But for me and for some other people, where taking that rest day is really hard, or where you really are regimented and kind of stuck in the way that you're relating to your nutrition routine or your exercise routine, then for me, it really took digging into what was beneath the surface behind some of these things. And one of them you even mentioned, which is perfectionism, that helped me understand why it was so hard for me to make these changes and why I was holding on to my routine so tightly, even after I knew that some of these risks were involved, that made it a lot easier to make the changes that for a long time I just tried to like brute force essentially. And
Hmm.
people would tell me, oh, you need to make certain changes. And it wasn't easy. It always felt like I was scared in making them, or it always felt like I was uncertain about making them. And so I wish that I had sooner addressed the picture a lot more holistically, because once I did, I realized that the changes that I ended up making ended up influencing my life in ways beyond just
Mm,
the physiological
mm,
and physical symptoms and experiences that I was having. And it really improved my mental health and improved the
mm,
way that I
mm.
felt around my exercise and around my around food in general. And I think that that was one thing that never would have inspired me originally to make the changes, but made the changes completely worthwhile and really transformed my life in ways that I hadn't anticipated.
How did you end up discovering Reds and you were in this? You were where you were. How did it come to you?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one because I always am curious to hear when other people hear about it, like, how did they uncover it?
Right.
It really is, you know, very, very few people know about it. And they even say that it's like, I mentioned before, like, there could be the up to 70% of active women are like struggling with their energy availability. And
Mm,
yet there are
mm,
some other prevalent studies that are estimating, and of course it's kind of hard to get this hard and fast data, but there are some that really estimate that, like, fewer than 30% of people even know that this could be an issue. For me, I got to the point where I was really, really, really determined to try to figure out what was happening with my menstrual disturbances, because I had eventually gotten to the point over the course of like the first 4 years where I realized, oh, this is an issue and I need to really address this. And then I just started doing a ton of research. I started really educating myself on this topic. I started to even like reach out to other specialists that existed in this space, and
mhm,
I got eventually went down the rabbit hole enough that I ended up getting like trained to be able to support other people who are struggling with this
say,
type of issue, and then developing a program myself. But it all started for me in just trying to take the situation into my own hands, because I
mm.
didn't feel like I had somebody who was helping my journey and who was kind of hand holding my way through the diagnosis and the recovery and every all the changes that I needed to make. And so at that point, I just through sheer willpower, I ended up doing a lot of research and trying to figure this out on my own. And I think that if you go through enough pathways where you tie together a lot of these different threads, oh, missing period, runner, female, like injury, then you start to, it does start to come out of the weeds a little bit. But it's something that I wish every active woman just knew about and knew how
Mm.
to catch the signs and knew what the risks were, and so that it was really embedded into how people approach their fitness and their health.
Did you have to resist, Allison, using your perfectionism to work with it? I mean, how do you what's the recovery of being a perfectionist? I mean, you being less perfect, you letting things go? I mean, when you learn about this kind of thing that's afflicting you and not having your period for 6 years and affecting every part of your life, and then you realize that you're in it and you're trying to get yourself out of it, you actually have to kind of let go to go forward, right? It must have been difficult.
Yes, I that you just hit it on the head, and I think that you articulated it in a way that was really powerful, because when we are talking about earlier that we athletes, perfectionists,
Yeah.
whoever is going to be included in this camp here, are predisposed to believe that pushing through and that suffering is part of
Mm,
progress.
mm,
And I think that it's so interesting that one of the lessons, and I'm not going to even sit here and pretend to say, oh, and I'm no longer
right.
have any of those
Cured.
tendencies, and I've let go of any, pressure to achieve,
Yeah.
because I think that that was also a part of myself that I really appreciated. And it was something that I felt really was part of my core identity, and I still do. And so I think it was less so about, I no longer want to be a perfectionist in any way, and I want to not have any of those tendencies at all, as much as being able to shift the mindset about where is rest and recovery necessary, and
Mm.
where does slowing down become essential as part of progress, as part of moving forward. And being able to actually praise and give yourself a little bit, myself in this specific example, more permission to slow down in certain areas
Mm.
was really critical. And part of it was actually that lesson of learning
Hmm.
and being able to understand. For me, it was a lot about understanding the benefits and understanding the purpose because that's how I approach a lot of things. And once I did, it was actually the shift of, oh, any sort of rest is lazy and it's unproductive and you shouldn't do it, to I actually understand why there are benefits to me doing this and I'm going to challenge myself to do it. And then over time, conditioning myself when they have these, um, they have these, the whole concept of habituation, which we can go into, but the kind of the short of it, the summary is that once you continue to do that more and more and more, you realize and you learn, oh wait, the worst fears that I had around this thing that I avoided for so long didn't happen.
Hmm.
It didn't even come true. It wasn't even, I didn't lose my fitness because I took one day off. I
Right.
didn't, my body didn't completely change because I didn't exercise this one day or whatever else those fears are. And sometimes it kind of requires that digging to really like pull them up and understand what they are specifically to you. But I think that it was helpful in being able to understand that combination of this is serving a purpose, and if I do it repeatedly and then realize actually nothing bad happens, now it's something that I can do quite easily and incorporate into
Hmm.
my routine. But it does require that journey that you kind of have to go on in order to get there. And I will say, from my own lived experiences and just having seen other people and supported their journey, there definitely is an easy way and there definitely is a hard
Hmm.
way.
Hmm.
And what breaks my heart is that when folks, you know, like myself, who are used to taking that hard route are so determined and then end up trying to like fix everything through sheer willpower and
Hmm.
determination, when sometimes, to your point, it does require letting go a little bit. And sometimes that can just look like accepting help and accepting that you don't have to do it on your own. You don't have to take the hardest route. And that's not always the most effective route.
Hmm.
And I say that because sometimes I've seen folks take years and years, like I did on their recovery, um, because they were resisting. And in my case, it was that I just truly didn't have an option. I
Hmm.
truly didn't know what the easier route could look like. But in cases where there is a support pathway that can streamline that journey for you, that sometimes the fastest path to recovery is being able to allow yourself that support.
Hmm.
And sometimes it can take this 3 to 5 year recovery journey where that can, every single day that it's going by is impacting your bone health. It's impacting how your muscles are either building or catabolizing. And so every single day it can be really impactful, and it can take that down from like 5 years to 3 months, 6 months. Very, very stark changes in what a timeline can look like. And so it's one where like that belief of, okay, if it's just sheer willpower and determination, I will do it. It's going to be so productive is actually false. And another area where maybe either slowing down or doing a different approach or being willing to ask for help, kind of like setting out from what we might normally do, can be really beneficial. So it's something I'm still learning and reminding
Hmm.
myself all the time, but I have definitely had to grow a lot through the process. And the fact that this recovery ended up having to happen ended up being a blessing because it actually pushed me to explore these areas that I might have continued to ignore for a really long time that were absolutely showing up in other areas of my life, like with work or, how I was approaching other aspects that didn't
Hmm.
have to be so hard.
Yeah, you mentioned habits, and I want to talk about identity for a moment because I remember hearing you say something what you were practicing at a run or something, and somebody actually called you a runner, and you were in. Well, I'm not a runner. I never really thought of myself as that, because you're just doing the running and you're practicing, and so your identity kind of gets changed a little bit and makes you kind of because you're just so deep into the pain and into pushing forward as an athlete, you create these habits that you're just used to, and then when you finally discover that you're in a place where you shouldn't be, pulling yourself out can be, a long process. So let's just talk about that whole identity about when we think somebody's in this space, what can we do to help? How can we kind of change the identity? You talked about asking questions. What kind of questions should we ask them, or should they be asking themselves?
Yeah. And the identity one is an interesting one because there's sort of there's sort of two ways that my brain goes when it comes to identity. One is that, we're so tied into this identity that we've built around being the healthy one and being the
Mm,
fit one, that we're so
mm,
scared of taking on any habit that might threaten that in any single way, shape, or form. And I think it's interesting because in some ways it is helpful to expand our identity and to be able to say, what are other things that contribute to our sense of self beyond just food and exercise?
mm,
And that could either be because you have passions, or because you have relationships, or because you have purposes or work or whatever it is. And this is actually a lot of the work that I end up doing with folks through the recovery journey, is being able to expand that so that everything isn't falling on these very specific aspects of health and identity and feeling like that's all that we are. And I think that I find this to be especially the case when folks are either like really involved in the fitness community, or they're competing, in specific like fitness competitions. That could be anything from like a marathon to like a CrossFit competition, to where they've really tied how they're being evaluated onto some of these aspects. I think that the other aspect of it that my mind goes to, though, that I think is interesting and also adjacent, is that I think that in some cases there can be then a swing of like, oh, I'm going to go from like full healthy and fit, and that's 100% of my identity, and then swing over to be like, so then I need to let go of it, and I can't have that be any part of who I am, and I need to completely mourn that side of me. And I think that that can also be very upending and really disappointing, because I think
mm,
that there are aspects where, yes, you might have to learn how to take more rest, and you might have to reevaluate how you're relating to exercise and how you're relating to nutrition. But a lot of this is actually in service of health.
mm,
And so it's not that you completely have to let go of exercise altogether. It's not to say that we have to go to the other extreme, which also isn't necessarily the best or most helpful route for your long-term health, or even like your mental state of being, which is how do we think about health more holistically, and we think about it inclusive of sleep. I've heard you talk about some with other guests, which is like sleep or stress, or your mental health, or your relationships, or connections that you have, and really open up that definition to be more inclusive of other things that include health, so that health might not be working out every single day, especially
mm,
if it's like super, super stressful for you, or if you're chronically not sleeping for a long period of time. How can we allow the space for you to potentially modify your training or take a rest day because we're accommodating these other factors, versus putting everything down on exercise and everything down on
mm,
nutrition? And then actually changing some of those shifts. So, mentioning that energy availability, changing some of those shifts in nutrition from what we thought might have been really, really healthy and necessary for our health into, well, we're making some of these shifts because it's actually going to lead to better health outcomes
right.
for you and your training, and then also in your day to day, and your energy and your long term health and your bone health and so many different aspects. And I think that, so when we go back to questions that you could be asking yourself or asking somebody who might be experiencing this, then a lot of that might come down to questions like, how much of your identity is really grounded on exercise and grounded on nutrition, or what is your definition of health? How do you want to relate to health? How do you want to relate to food? What does that look like for you? And what does it feel like right now? And I think that sometimes those are harder questions to ask somebody else
Mm,
as much as it is to ask yourself.
mm,
And I only say that because if you're coming from a place of, I'm not experiencing this, I don't struggle with this, and I'm trying to ask you these questions because it seems like you have a problem. So again, going into that judgmental view, then it might be more powerful to like maybe send them this episode directly and say like,
mm,
hey, I found this thing super interesting, and I thought it could be, and I'm curious what you think about it. And really allowing them their own journey and connecting them to those resources, because I think that the most important questions can be the ones that we ask ourselves. And so sometimes when even if we're thinking that we don't have this issue, it can be sometimes helpful just to even reflect. We all have our own very unique relationship when it comes to food, and our unique relationship when it comes to exercise. And I'm talking about one extreme, and some people are on the other extreme. I think in both cases, it can be really valuable to ask ourselves some of these questions, and a helpful learning because of how that might impact. Like, identity can even show up in other aspects in the other end of the spectrum, where it's like maybe we aren't even starting exercise because of how we're relating to identity. So I always encourage folks, like, start by asking yourself, start by how it feels to ask yourself, and then that might also influence how you approach the conversation with someone else, because these tend to be really personal topics for people
Mm.
that that can sometimes be really isolating, and thinking that you're the only one that deals with issues around body image or issues around food and overthinking food, or thinking you're doing the wrong thing or the right thing when it comes to food or exercise, and feeling like you're doing right or wrong things. And I think that that kind of pressure and that kind of language is really normalized in terms of how we think about health, that can also make it really hard for us to have open conversations about it.
Yeah, well said, Alison. I think also identity. I think the word control has to come in. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday who I don't want to say this blatantly, but maybe is in this area because she works out every day. And, in talking to her yesterday, she's like, there's so much chaos in my life, things I can't control, relationships, work, etc. I can control how much I work out, and I'm in control of my body, and I'm working out every day, and I'm only eating this, so the frustration of not being able to control the things they can't control. Whereas, look, I can control what I put in my mouth. I can control that I drive to the gym and how much I work out, regardless of how I feel and how I have to push through. I think control has to come into the discussion as well.
That is a really good insight. Yeah. So many times there's some aspect of control that's going into, especially when we're like really exerting a lot of discipline
Mm,
and, and control, quite frankly, around our food and our exercise. That comes back to kind of coping mechanisms,
mm,
which is, I love that you mentioned in this example, this notion of like, oh, there's chaos everywhere, and this
right.
is one thing that I feel like I can control. And a lot of times it's interesting because we're either using it as a coping mechanism for stress, or we're using it because we believe that through these areas, if we just hold on tightly enough, then we'll be able to control all the outcomes, like, whether it's like how we feel about our body, or what like fitness achievements that we'll have, or maybe that there's a layer of comparison that comes in here, and it's like, well, if we do this, then we know we'll have this same outcome as this other person we're seeing online, or this person that we're seeing on some removed scale that is recommending some of these things, and that we need to emulate in order to have the exact same outcomes that they're promising. And I think that we're then using these areas that we can control, and then when stress occurs, holding on tighter and tighter and tighter.
Mm,
And I think that this goes back to that addiction and exercise addiction component that we were talking about, which is why are we exercising? And if we're using it most frequently as this coping mechanism, and it's one of our only coping mechanisms, where something stressful or out of our control or chaotic or scary happens outside in our lives, and then we are going into our routine even more because that's where we feel safe and that's our safe space, then it can become this really reinforcing situation. And that is so important and illustrative as to why fixing and addressing all these things that are happening underneath ends up being so critical and important. Because if we're stuck in this like kind of almost this cycle where people are telling us, oh, you're so healthy, we're getting that validation, we're controlling because we see other people or other health advice or other experts in the space that are maybe recognizing this or recommending it in certain ways, and so therefore we are holding on even tighter to that. And then in all the other areas, we're not necessarily addressing face on, because we have this like control in the safe area, the things that we might actually be struggling with. So that could be
mm,
stress in our lives, it could be our own body image, it could be our sense of self-worth. And these are the things that we don't often relate the whole picture together. And usually on day one, what I'm talking about with folks is like, all right, so let's talk about your nutrition. Let's talk about exactly what changes you're going to make to your training, because that's where it starts. And quite frankly, that is where changes most tangibly and explicitly need to be made. But a lot of the times, it's later in the journey that we start realizing, oh, okay, so we tried to make this change and it was really hard. What happened? And then we start to unpack some of these other areas that I think are sometimes the more interesting and meaningful conversations that become the bigger wins that we get as a result of making the changes that at the first seems like changes on the surface. And
Hmm.
so it's just funny because sometimes I feel like I'm like selling this like huge fake drug that's like, and then you'll fix your digestive issues and you'll have better
Mm.
energy and then you're gonna have a better relationship with all these other areas. But it's why I got into this and why I'm so passionate about it, because I think that there's so many women especially, but it's absolutely gender agnostic, where
Hmm.
the pressures that we experience either because of stress or because of the pressures around body or fitness expectations that we have, it's so easy to fall into this trap. And there's so many people that are then experiencing this type of low energy availability and normalizing it, that we really underestimate how much it could be contributing to areas of our own lives that are preventing us from realizing our full potential. And I lived it firsthand, and I've just seen it happen so many times that it's really what makes me so passionate about this topic, and helping and supporting others in any way that I can.
Hmm. So, when I started my business, I was working way too hard. I'm going to draw a slight parallel, right? So I put exercise behind me. I was, starting a business, 14, 16-hour days, not eating very well. Next thing I know, I'm at the doctor and she's telling me that, I'm 340 pounds and you're not going to see your daughter graduate if you don't lose the weight. So, when I got up to that weight, Allison, just like you said, my body just got used to it. It's wonderful. And sure, I lose my breath a little bit going upstairs, but I just got used to it. And I didn't think being a 46-inch waist. I mean, I was just, it was just part of what I was doing. I was focused on everything else. But once that reality hit me, once she said that and she mentioned my daughter, I'm thinking to myself, what have I done? This is something that I've done to myself. And now I'm not responsible for my young person in my 20s who can be defeated by nothing, right? What have I done to my family now? So I took the next 7 days. I worked out a lot. I changed everything I did and lost about 130 pounds. And again, you can't look at it as a finishing line, right? When you lose weight, when you get to where you need to be, you can't go back to your old habits. We see like 90% of people who lose the weight gain the weight back, and you have to completely change the way you work. So people want a one word answer, and you mentioned it, you've alluded it to in this conversation. I've heard you say it many times before. The one word answer I say as to how I kept it off and leave it off is discipline, right? Just focus, routine, constraint, just all part of what I feel is the discipline spectrum. I wonder how discipline plays a role in your life, Allison Yamamoto.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting because that narrative that you're mentioning is, well, first of all, inspiring.
Yeah.
So congratulations on like the hard work that you put into to shift your own like habits and routines. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting about the word discipline is how much we hear it in the
Mm,
context
mm,
of success stories of, and then you just had to exhibit so much control, and you had to exhibit so much like avoidance and restriction, and then therefore like I achieved all the things I need to achieve. And and I think that it's one of those, it's kind of like the same thing that I like to mention to people a lot, which is that we conflate weight loss advice with health advice. And so oftentimes people are saying, oh, well, this is weight loss advice, so it's like healthy, we have to do it. And then we're
mm,
like grabbing onto like, well, I don't want to gain weight, so I guess I want to do that too. And
hmm,
in many cases, that can be what is perpetuating this narrative. For example, that like women are vastly underestimating how much they need to eat just to keep the lights on in many cases, and especially active women who have even higher energy demands. And so the normalization of like eating that chronically deficient of what we need can be something that like I'm not even talking about cases where people are intentionally eating less than what they need. I'm saying that like this is just a normalized thing where a lot of women are struggling with this, and I suspect a lot of people in general. So I think that sorry, I totally realize that we're
Come
coming
on
back to
back.
discipline now. We're coming back to discipline. Is that it's it's interesting because it's realizing that sometimes discipline looks like not always having to be in that same rigor. You can be
Mm,
disciplined
mm,
and you can create space in your life that isn't always so restrictive. So it doesn't mean that you have to follow every single rule to a T, and it doesn't mean that one slip from that rule or one spout of imperfection means that you were completely derailed. And I think it's interesting. There was this kind of graph or like maybe just image that I saw that where you see progress and you usually see it as a straight line. You see it as
mm,
a straight line that's just
mm.
going up, and so you think that progress means it's improvement from the prior constantly. It's constantly you're doing better than where you were yesterday. And then when you zoom in, you actually see that that line is actually just a continuation of all these up and downs that
Right.
are just trending in that direction. And so I think that if we think about discipline less as like that line needs to be straight and it
Mm,
needs to be trending up, and it needs to be like just headed up in a perfectly straight path at all times versus saying, no, we actually see it as sometimes it's going to be better and sometimes it's going to go down, it's going to be up and down. But we want to think about it in terms of how it's generally trending as more important and more valuable than exactly whether or not the exact dot that you added today was exactly in line with the trend line that you're expecting.
mm.
And so for me, discipline is much more in the awareness that it is that up and down. And so I think that that can be, for me at least, like a very powerful visual and understanding that, yes, sometimes health for some people might look like having vegetables with that very, clear mix of like the lean protein or whatever it is that we're often seeing in like the conventional health advice that we're seeing. And sometimes health can look like I need to get something in right now and I don't have a perfect option. And instead of skipping this, I'm going to have something because I know it's appropriate for me, or allowing myself to go out with my friends and eat the thing that I really want to have because that's okay.
Hmm.
And we're still moving along this general curve where we're thinking about health more holistically and we're making progress. And that's more important than any sort of perfection that we're trying to achieve.
Certainly is. So, I mean, as a child, Allison, you were in this household, high performing parents, they're athletes. And was discipline kind of, was it blatantly stated? Was it implied?
So it's so interesting because I think it was probably more implied than explicitly stated. And um, and I say that because maybe it's also that I'm like a firstborn that might go into it. And
Ah,
sometimes
me
I feel
too.
like
Yeah.
firstborn
Yeah.
kids tend to have this like
Right.
very high expectation for themselves. I don't know. I'm curious to hear from you if you either resonate with that or don't, just
Mm,
so that I can have some more data points. But um, I felt like it was one thing where when I was growing up, my relationship with exercise was so healthy. It was such a second thought. I think that part of that was because my entire family was very active. So I
mm,
didn't really have to think that hard about it to incorporate exercise. And I think a lot of other people can probably likely relate to this because when you're in the younger years, especially if you're in high school or you go to a school that has these athletic programs, you might have participated in some sort of sport or activity or PE, and you never really had to think about it because it was something that you were either forced to do or you just like had to show up for practice, and that was the structure that you followed. And I just happened to also be, I mean, I think that the benefits of being from an active family was that we also sought a lot of activities that were, our pastimes were active. So we would go to the mountains, we would be going hiking, we'd be going skiing, we'd be going. So we enjoyed doing a lot of those more active. We tend to do more active things, and I think that one thing that's interesting is that in transition moments is when we're more likely to slip into some of these patterns where we go into more, we might fall into more low energy availability.
Hmm.
And compelling events could look like I'm graduating from high school and I no longer have that routine. And so now I'm in full control, but like I feel like I'm not in any control. So now I feel like I have to like exhibit a lot of control over it. Or, oh, I'm going through, I just had a kid and now my body has changed as a result. And I feel like I have to bounce back as quickly as possible. And those are instances where we're more likely to slip. And it could be any of these. We get a new job, we get in a relationship, we get out of a relationship. Like all of these moments, we don't always think about how they might be impacting these other areas, but they make us more vulnerable to fall into some of these states. And so I think that growing up, I never thought that when it came to exercise specifically, I felt like I needed to exert a lot of discipline. But I did see, not just from my own family, but as well as from pretty much every signal that I would get back from coaches or from teachers or even from peers, that when I did well based on external factors, so like based on a grade or based on whether or not I got into this certain program or based on whether or not I made this certain team, that was praised and that
Hmm.
was something that I therefore found positively reinforcing. And so I think that I was one of those people that fell into that cycle, whereas like,
Hmm.
oh, this is what I need to do in order to continue to achieve. And that feels good to do that. And so I'm going to continue to do whatever it takes to make sure that I achieve these outcomes.
Hmm.
And I think that that was the lesson that really instilled that level of discipline in me. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some part of growing up in a family where a lot of my parents, for example, were athletes, were used to doing endurance related activities
Hmm.
that maybe implicitly or not encouraged me to be able to feel comfortable with suffering. And that lesson maybe could have been taught from like memories that I have of like, being in situations where I was kind of uncomfortable. I used to be really, really scared of heights, and we would go on hikes where absolutely that was challenged. But
Hmm.
in order for me to get to the top of the thing, like I I had to get through a lot of fear that I had, and only to realize that like I was probably in situations where people who are equally scared as heights as I am, which is not maybe extremely, would have also been really scared because of the situation that we were in.
Hmm.
But I think that that was also, a helpful lesson because in some ways it allowed me to then feel comfortable and know how to challenge myself in those situations. But later on, having to learn the opposite, which is how to realize when it's okay to be like, look, like, this is discomfort in a way that's actually a red flag, and I'm not going to choose to do this, versus this is discomfort where I have to make it through no matter what because I'm determined to get to the top of the hill or whatever it is, metaphorically speaking.
Hmm. Drive.
Hmm. Exactly.
Has there been anything in recent history, Allison, that you've changed your mind on?
I feel like I'm changing my mind on things, not constantly, but I am someone who believes that it's really important to be able to take in new signals and new information and
Hmm.
update your beliefs accordingly.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that one thing that I've changed my mind on recently is I feel like I have too many examples. So that's why I'm trying to think of one. One thing that I've changed my mind on recently was related to, I think, the main like causes that lead to this type of situation where someone's in low energy availability. And so for a really long time, I thought that in order to be in this state, it kind of mandated that one person was in a semi extreme situation like I was, where it's
Hmm.
like you are exhibiting a lot of control and maybe even restriction around food, and you are experiencing fairly extreme signals, like you're missing your period, and so therefore, like, missing a period is kind of one of the more extreme versions of what can happen
Hmm.
when you're in low energy availability. And one of the things that I've really changed my mind on is is how important and how prevalent it is amongst people that aren't doing it knowingly and are doing it and don't have any of those super extreme, um, like, I guess, symptoms that they're experiencing. And the reason I've changed my mind on this is that I was actually like researching about this topic a little bit more and learning about some of the more subtle indicators that this could be happening and some of the risk factors that can be affiliated with even some of the subtle situations where it's not as extreme.
Hmm.
And how even in the more subtle cases, that can still be impacting the way that your body is metabolizing food. It can be impacting your own performance. It can be impacting your own like mental acuity and capacity. And I think that it wasn't until I started learning that there's like forget about all of the like more critical health risks that exist, which is what I was speaking about and worried about and talking about for so long. But realizing how much of a performance related, and when I say performance, I mean in any way. This could be how you're showing up at work, how you're showing up and have energy throughout the day, how you're showing up in your relationships, all the way through to how are you showing up in your workouts, therefore how are you gaining fitness, therefore how is your body composition impacted. That all of those things are really impacted when the energy availability is being mismanaged.
Hmm.
And it was learning that helped me kind of open my mind in terms of thinking about who is served by this type of information and who could benefit from making some of these changes. And my and believing that my prior approach was perhaps too narrow and also too extreme from what the reality is.
Hmm. What a wonderful world it would be, Allison, if we could all resign to the fact that we can change our mind on any given subject given new evidence. Versus those that kind of dig in and, because I reserve that right. And it looks like you do as well, just to be open. What motivates you, Allison?
I think that on this specific area, what motivates me the most is a lot of the experiences that I've had,
Hmm.
and that is whether that be through my own lived experiences as well as the changes I've seen in other people, and being able to have even a slight impact on another person's life in the same way that my life was changed, whether it's because they're experiencing more connection with other people or because they're actually performing better
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
the gym or
Hmm.
in, I've had clients come to me and say like, my partner actually mentioned observable changes in my mood and in my happiness, like unprompted because of how. And those are the types of things that like really light me up. I
Hmm.
I can't even express the amount that I'm grateful for the people that I get to work with because of how they fuel me in ways that they may not even realize. And so I think that's something that is a huge, huge motivator
Hmm.
for me.
Impact. Well, you light up when you talk about it. It's when I know that I've helped a friend, even if it's a quarter of a percent, that they've, gotten better or been helped, and I had some influence on. I don't know if there's a greater reward. So, given that motivation, Allison, how do you measure success?
Yeah, so I think that well, I feel like I could take that question two different ways. So I could take that in terms of how do I measure my success in terms of me doing things that are motivating for me and energizing. And then there's also me measuring success in terms of how do I know that the people that I'm helping are being helped
Mm,
effectively.
mm,
So maybe I'll answer the second one first, and then I'll go to the first one. So the second one, which is like, how do I measure success for people that I work with? And this is, I'm very like results oriented, like outcome oriented. And so there's a few different signals that we would use. One of them is like symptom based. So we do like track and assess like symptoms. One of them is, well, if you are experiencing menstrual disturbances, there's a lot of like feedback we can get from that. So, for example, like getting your period back would be a huge one. Getting it consistently with a natural cycle would be a great leading indicator. But then there's also other ones in terms of like if they are working with a clinician, then you can see improvements on objective measures over time. And then the last one is going to be a lot more anecdotal, which is like everyone has specific goals, and how we're tracking towards the goals is going to be the third one. And that's in many instances like the most important one, because it's the ones that people experience the most like profoundly, I would say, for themselves, when it's
Mm.
something that is like glaring for them that they want to see changed in their own lives. For myself, and in terms of how I measure my own success and whether or not I'm doing the things that are motivating for me, I think it's interesting because I read this book that they were talking about how you can like assess your energy levels, and throughout the day assess of the things that you did, what were the things that you found energizing and what was draining on your energy. And I've done that type of assessment just for myself. It doesn't take very long. I'd encourage anyone to do it, which essentially just like look at your calendar. You can look at a typical day in the week or maybe a couple days. And out of the things in your day, what are the things that were filling up your cup and what are the things that were really, really draining? Or how would you rate your energy tank if you're looking at like a gas tank throughout each of those activities? And I'm constantly trying to shift it so that I'm doing more of the things that really provide me with more energy and less of the things that I find really, really draining. And leaning into times when I, find that I'm helping someone and that they're noticing these clear wins that I'm seeing in them, having conversations where I feel like I'm talking about things that could potentially help somebody else who's listening, or like connecting with people. I love connecting with people who have questions or might be thinking they might be having a problem, or who have a similar experience that they want to share their story with me, is also something that I find really energizing, and something that really lights me up. So
Mm.
being able to kind of orient my days more so around those things that find energy energizing is one way that I would measure success.
It's the trait of an incredible, magnificent person. So you went through this, and I want to say you're mostly out of it. You understand it. You understand how to get out of it. And many people will just kind of close the door on that. But you have decided to help others with it. I mean, that's remarkable. I wish there was more people like that. I commend you for that. Anybody listening and they need to talk to you, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so my website is theallymethod.com, and the best way to get in touch with me is through Instagram. And so I'm at Allison Yamamoto, it's my name. And if you want to connect, message me, reach out. I always love chatting with folks. And so would love to hear from you all there.
Allison, Allison, Yamamoto, Yamamoto. You're on Instagram, Linktree, TikTok. Hello at AllisonYamamoto.com and your website as well. We'll make sure we put all those in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope when I'm in your area next time we can get a cup of tea.
I would love that. Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
You be well, Allison. Bye now.
You too.
Thank you for listening and or viewing Joey Pin's Discipline Conversations. Please share this episode with one or two of your friends who you think may benefit from the episode. Our website, www.joeypins.com. There you'll find lots of resources and you could join our mailing list. Please follow us on all our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Podcast information, the video version of our podcast is on YouTube. Please subscribe. Audio is on all major podcasting platforms. Please follow them. And if you like it, please consider giving 5-star rating. Would really appreciate that. Thank you again for listening or watching Joey Pin's Discipline Conversations.